Hello, my name is Leslie Graham, and it is a great pleasure to welcome you all today in the name of La Société Française d'Études Écossaises, the French Society for Scottish Studies. So today we're going to hear about David Leishman's book on Irn-Bru and consumer nationalism. And we hope that this might be the first of at least two book presentation events, with the next one taking place at the end of this month around Philippe Laplace's recent publication, L'île aux confins du monde, St. Kilda, à travers 5 siècles de récits. We're going to organise this event as follows. After this very short introduction, David will present his book for about 20 minutes. And then there'll be a short discussion with Nathalie Duclos, who is the Vice President of the SFEE and a Professor of British Studies at the University of Toulouse. And then we'll open up to you, the participants, for a question and answer session. But first of all, a word about David Leishman. He is a maître de conférence at Grenoble-Alpes Université, where he teaches English for Business Studies. He has a background in marketing, since before doing his PhD in Scottish Studies at Grenoble University, he obtained a degree in marketing from Strathclyde Business School. Now, the book that David will be presenting, which I have here, is in fact the first ever in-depth commercial history of what is almost certainly Scotland's most iconic brand. In the book, David explores Barr's Irn-Bru's transnational origins and analyses the ways in which the brand grew and developed, concentrating on its nation-building discourses and the various forms those have taken over a period that spans 3 centuries. He draws on a very wide variety of international sources, archive research, vintage advertising, government reports, industrial histories. And it's tempting to put the popularity of this sugary, fluorescent orange drink that we all love so much as a symbol of national pride down to clever advertising alone. But David's study makes it clear that things are more complicated than that, and that the consumer nationalism the product evokes cannot be understood without an in-depth dive into questions of globalization, national identification, mass consumerism, marketing, media, and perhaps manipulation. So thank you, David, for having agreed to come online this evening to talk about this book, which was published at the end of last year. The full title is Consumer Nationalism and Barr's Irn-Bru in Scotland, and it's published by Palgrave Macmillan, and you can find it on their website. For those of you who are watching the recording, I must just warn you that I unfortunately missed just the first minute or so of David's presentation because I forgot to hit record.
Quite a lot on questions of, well, what I termed consumer nationalism, which drew from studies of banal nationalism and everyday nationalism. And so that was quite, I was quite indebted in that sense to works by people like Michael Billig and Tim Edensor, whose work I discovered during this research project. And then that led me into a whole field of study into banal nationalism, commercially mediated nationalism, consumer nationalism. And that was very, very important in kind of grounding this theoretically. In terms of where the book came from as well, it was something I'd hoped was a kind of continuation of the PhD that I did into contemporary Scottish literature and how that worked as a contemporary manifestation of national discourses. But after having worked on literature, I was really interested in trying to find a very much mass-mediated form of discourse. I was kind of bearing in mind that, you know, no matter how much of a highbrow, how much of a cultural impact in terms of culture, maybe with a capital C, a work like James Kelman's How Late It Was, How Late could have, it sold around 20,000 hard copies, whereas there's something like 60 million bottles of Irn-Bru sold every year. And I was really interested in trying to look at that sort of, very much lowbrow, mass-mediated form of national identity. The choice of Irn-Bru came quite naturally, in that I grew up in Scotland in the 1980s, where Irn-Bru was very much a kind of self-evident touchstone for everything that was Scottish. It was just inescapably and unquestionably a paragon of Scottishness. And to the extent that it was kind of evident for me when I started that it was an originally Scottish product. Their slogan was original and best. And the first thing that I really intended to do was simply to maybe write an article about how they had leveraged this Scottishness and maybe use of Scottish imagery, and then, just a small study into the sort of Scottish themes they had used over the years. If we start looking at how the book is structured, the first thing, therefore, that I picked up on was the question of origins. And the first chapter I entitled The Power of Origins, to try and look into this question of the historical primacy and authenticity of the drink, because the first thing that I quickly discovered when I started looking at this was that the drink's origin was disputed, and there was something of a cultural debate about whether the drink was actually Scottish or was actually English. And with different companies all vying for the question of who was the legitimate producer and the originator of the drink. When I looked more closely, I saw that bars themselves didn't actually claim, nowadays in any case, they didn't actually claim to be the historical originator of the drink. And they simply refer to themselves as one producer among many. And that led to the question, well, who was producing Irn-Bru in the early days? Where did it originate from? What were its geographical roots? And also, interestingly, I came across this idea that from an early era, bars had made it quite clear that, no, yes, they were the historical originators. In 1911, they were saying this quite openly. So the whole question of plagiarism and commercial authenticity led me into a study of how brands are kind of inescapably rooted in these complex supply chains, in international markets, in questions of the provenance of their raw materials. And it becomes quite difficult to actually ascertain what is distinctly national, what is really a national drink. When I started to look into the question of the origins of Irn-Bru, it became quite clear that actually it was an international drink. It was a drink which was known as the national soft drink of South Africa. It was, in the early days, an ideal American tonic, and it was discovered it was still commercialized by at least one company in the US. It's a beverage which is fondly remembered in Canada as a distinctively national soft drink. So there's a whole sense of, therefore, if it had become a Scottish drink, it was through a sort of series of institutionalized forgettings. And even, for example, the American manufacturer who still manufactures it today refers to it as a Scottish beverage. And so what I wanted to try and do was historicize the drink and try to get a better sense of how it was rooted in these questions of its early commercialization. So I started looking at some of the early advertising for Irn-Bru. That took me to Jamaica, where the earliest ads that I could find for Irn-Bru came from. And for a while, I imagined it was perhaps some kind of Scottish Jamaican drink, because the first advertiser was McNeish beverage manufacturer, McNeish aerated waters. But it turns out that, in fact, this was an American drink, and that it was an American chemicals company who produced the essence and who'd commercialized this all across America and then into other locales like the Caribbean as well. So this this led me to the United States, as I said, to try and get a sense of how the question of these international supply chains conditioned this early market for soft drinks, And it showed up the importance of these large essence manufacturers for various reasons, which would tend to be the ones who would have an international presence, whereas the bottlers, they tended to be, again, for supply chain reasons, they tended to be very much small scale local affairs like Barr's in Falkirk or Glasgow. The drink itself was introduced in the UK by an English company, Stevenson and Howell, who are based in London, who introduced their Irn-Bru essence into the UK market in 1898, and who trademarked some of the marketing imagery that we know today from the beverage, such as the strongman figure. And this was very much the figure that Barr's incorporated. They ordered the bottle labels from Stevenson and Howell. They were partners of Stevenson and Howell. And as early as 1900, possibly 1898, 1899, it was clear that Barr's were selling this beverage with some ties to this company, Stevenson and Howell. However, the official story is that Barr's invented their own Irn-Bru in 1901. So we're not entirely sure about the period before 1901 or even, around about 1901. It's a little unclear. This question of strength and the barbells and the strongman, this led me to the second chapter, and the question of the symbolism of iron and strength, which was kind of innately tied to the beverage. And in this chapter, I wanted to continue this look at myth making and try to look at how the questions of strength and power leached into Scottish national identity. But it was also important to try and underline how initially, in any case, the beverage itself wasn't a particularly Scottish national beverage at all. That because of this theme of strength and power and physical muscularity, it was actually building on very generic international or British tropes of athleticism. And that was very clear in the early Barr's advertising. They weren't really interested in Scottish Highland figures at all. It was all about images of sportsmen. And this question of national strength or strength, having a national dimension, became clear during the war when this question of being resilient, being strong, being forceful could be used in military imagery. We see that quite a lot in the 1940s. And then as we get into the 1980s, there was this very powerful campaign made in Scotland from girders, which reaffirmed the drink's Scottish credentials and really tied that to the question of strength, but at the same time, linking it to Scotland's industrial heritage at a time of rapid deindustrialization. And also at a time when the soft drinks market was opening up to increased American competition, and a small-scale Scottish manufacturer, well, large for the country, but small in international terms, was very much at the, let's say, was in some jeopardy in the face of this these large US corporations like Pepsi and Coke, who were increasing their marketing spend at the time. So Barr's made a deliberate decision to increase their marketing spend at the time to try and take on these American giants. And that led to a kind of boom in terms of their visibility as a brand. As we went into the 1990s and 2000s, the brand tried to penetrate further the UK market, and that led to them toning down their national credentials and also toning down this rather gritty, industrial, muscular image to try and appeal to younger English drinkers. So we had a brief period where we had much less nationally influenced advertising, but nevertheless, the advertising at this time tried to build on the sense of strength as a mental attribute. And they tried to link the brand to the sense of a kind of willful maverick identity who would be resilient, full of self-belief, willful. And that also then had a certain cultural relevance, both to possibly the UK, but also to Scotland, in the sense of a cultural resilience in the face of adversity. And that could have continued relevance in the 2000s in sort of austerity Britain when they adopted the slogan, Irn-Bru gets you through. And it was also something of a dual track discourse from now on, because it had to be a message of cultural resilience and individualism and distinctive identity that could play in both markets, that would be understood in the Scottish market as Scottish, but understood in the UK market as not too Scottish, as potentially neutral and more individualistic. The question of the cultural impact, however, I tried to make the focus of the next chapter. And in the next chapter, I wanted to look at how Irn-Bru leached into the general culture in terms of two main strands, how the brand was kind of physically rooted in the material way and a material presence in terms of the urban landscape, and how that could impact the sense of national distinctive lived experience. And also look at how the brand played into popular culture and was maybe mediated by popular culture as well. So that took me to questions, as I said, of things like, you know, the visual impact of the built environment in retail, but also in cityscapes. And it also took me, it led me to look at things like how the brand is given legitimacy as it is co-opted by different institutional relays, such as political parties or the media, or how it's associated with other elements of Scottish culture and given a sense of distinctiveness and cultural authority there. Because we were thinking about it as a form of mass-mediated national identity as well, I thought it was interesting to look at how the brand is also taken up by individual consumers and integrated into their own identity discourses at an individual and national level as well. And so I looked at things like how Irn-Bru is kind of hacked or adopted or co-opted by people for Irn-Bru tattoos and Irn-Bru weddings, Irn-Bru funerals, and what that could possibly mean, and how that could represent at least some form of consumer agency, in the sense that we get quite a clear idea that these all tend to be non-officially sanctioned uses of the Irn-Bru brand. And so they would seem to represent some form of some sort of vying for control over the brand as a cultural resource, where the brand is no longer completely in control of what it actually means. This question of decoding the brand and recoding the brand and making sense of the brand, I thought was also a factor in social media use, in, for example, the social media marketing campaigns that the brand has put in place, as it tries to find ways to, in a relatively cost-effective manner, to engage with Scottish consumers. It uses quite a lot of these cheap Facebook advertising campaigns or Twitter advertising campaigns, which are quite cryptic, which have to be decoded by Scottish consumers, and where the very fact of understanding the joke becomes what sort of confirms your presence as a member of the in-group, as opposed to a member of the out-group. And these tend to be quite heavily reliant on the participants' knowledge of Scottish culture and pop culture. So I thought that was quite interesting to take a look at as well. The question of in-groups and out-groups led me to the last chapter, which was about how distinctively national themes were deployed in the brand's advertising. So to return really to the question of national themes in particular, I wanted to look at how these national themes were illustrated in the brand's advertising, but how also it would tend to revolve around this question of them and us, and then also how those questions of belonging and not belonging could be complexified in the brand's advertising. They were definitely complexified from the beginning, because it was, let's say, in the 1940s that the brand first really became a national, Scottish national brand. The very first Scottish, distinctively Scottish elements were introduced into a series of cartoon ads called The Adventures of Irn-Bru. in 1943, when the Indian lead character Irn-Bru was joined by a Scottish sidekick called Sandy. And it was in about 1949 that these Scottish themes really began to intensify and were quite heavily prominent in the 1950s. I don't know if you can read this one very well, but I thought this one is quite illustrative of the new, more intensively Scottish themes that were developed at the time. The English character Horace says, well, if you won't argue on politics, tell me what has Scotland that England hasn't got? Tell me that. And the answer is Barr's Irn-Bru. So the question of defining the brand's Scottish credentials is necessarily always in opposition to England. And I'll come back to that question in a moment. However, as we see also in the cartoon, it's mediated by characters which are not necessarily distinctively Scottish through this colonial Irn-Bru character, which for very obvious reasons they dropped in the early 1970s, along with the gollywog from Robertson's Jam and things like that. After a period, as we mentioned, after a period of relatively neglecting national themes, they returned to this in the 2000s, and we see a couple of, or a few examples of really quite manifestly vibrant, emphatic national discourses in their advertising from the 2000s as they re-engage with these celebrations of Scottish national identity. Again, not without controversy, as they tend to be seen as oppositional, as adversarial, in terms of maybe stoking anti-English animosity, in particular the New Fella commercial from 2013. But again, we see something of a more complex picture as the brand tries to engage sometimes with more hybrid figures, more complex, non-national or national figures. And in that sense of these kind of more complex hybrid identities, I thought this issue of the Jason Scotland campaign in 2006 was quite interesting. Very briefly, this was when, in the face of another defeat by the Scottish national team, Barr's Irn-Bru decided to support the team of Trinidad and Tobago in the World Cup and invited Irn-Bru fans to do the same, based on the fact that the player's name was Jason Scotland, one of the players in Trinidad and Tobago who played in a Scottish team at the time and who was quite well known. And this allowed them to use this strapline, Scotland's going to the World Cup. This led to a minor political and media kerfuffle when Jack McConnell indicated in an interview with the BBC that he too would be supporting Trinidad and Tobago, who happened to be playing in the same pool as England. And so when England would play, Scottish fans would be enjoined to support England, but to this ended up being the subject of this new announcements. And what I thought was interesting, the question that this hybrid figure that they'd chosen as being distinctively non-Scottish as their Scottish ambassador, it all finally revolved around Scotland versus England at the end of the day. And that was where the main sensibilities lay. So to finish off, where are we now? I think recent events have kind of validated some of the things that I found in the book, in that after January 2018 saw the withdrawal of the standard recipe of Irn-Bru from sale, and its replacement by most of the sugar in the recipe being replaced by sweetener. This led to issues of boycotts, of consumer discontent, and quite a negative backlash from Scottish Irn-Bru fans. And then finally, the reintroduction of a 1901 original recipe by Barr's to try and placate fans this year. What I think all of that showed was that the questions of authenticity, history, originality are clearly very marketable elements for the brand. They're very clearly resources that they value quite clearly. to Irn-Bru fans as well. These are very sensitive issues, and that the brand is very much a contested identity resource over which neither the brand nor the fans have complete control. One of the other conclusions that I can draw from the period afterwards is that the media and corporations are very resilient to objective truth. I know for a fact that what, for example, is on the Barr's website, where we can, I don't know if you can read that with the shared screen, if it's clear enough for you, but basically the brand site relays a known urban myth that Irn-Bru was invented by bars to satisfy the thirst of Glasgow steelworkers who were building Glasgow Central Station, but who were getting too drunk and who needed a drink that would be suitable for them to get through a long, hard day's work. I know they know this is not true. And at one point, they seemed quite amenable, because I did talk with the senior management in bars, and at one point they seemed quite amenable and even quite keen on discovering more about the brand than they actually did, because although they were curators of their own beverage and its history, they ultimately didn't know very much about it, and they were quite keen to discover more. However, once they did discover more, there came a point where, for obvious commercial reasons, they became quite reluctant to put this into play and to make changes to the marketing. The marketing director at one point said to me that he walked through the airport, because we'd been discussing the launch date of Irn-Bru, and they'd been coming to the conclusion that 1901 was a bit of an invention, that the strongman hadn't been invented by bars. This was something they didn't know. And they were quite keen to try and get a firm date for when the drink was actually launched in Scotland. And the marketing director said to me one day, though, that he walked through the airport and looked at a vending machine on which you had Original Best, Bars Irn-Bru, 1901. And it hit him that if they were going to make the change, every vending machine in Scotland would have to be changed. Every awning on every store would have to be changed. And I think there's just an inertia and a reluctance to make that kind of change. It's now the official story, and it's not going to change, I think. But also the media also now relay the story much more enthusiastically than any subsequent objective research into that. So I think maybe one element of further research would be to look at the power of these corporate and media relays, and how much they can distort something or model the truth to suit their ends. Another theme that continues to interest me is the question of how these same forces can play into questions of British national identity or Scottish unionist identity. Because one of the things that was very clear was that in the early 20th century, there was very little sense of a distinctively Scottish identity out with a British unionist or British imperial identity. And in particular, one of the things that would interest me would be to look at whiskey, and to look at when whiskey became distinctively Scottish. Because obviously, you know, Scotch whiskey is the preeminent Scottish product. But when you look at some of the older advertising for it, you see that it wasn't always, at least not unanimously, advertised using Scottish tropes and Scottish imagery. There was quite a strong tendency to present whiskey using very English, very British, very upper class imagery. And it was only maybe a bit later on that this really became more unanimously Scottish in tone. And that's definitely a theme that I would like to pick up on. So I'm coming to an end now. I hope I haven't spoken for too long. And thank you very much for your attention. And no doubt we'll pass over to Nathalie, who's got some questions.
Thanks very much, David. Thank you very much. I think maybe we could start. I'm going to start with maybe a difficult question, but it's because it's part of your title. I think maybe a lot of people listening to us won't be too familiar with the concept of consumer nationalism. So maybe you could say a bit more about that. I mean, in your introduction, you said that it was linked to everyday nationalism, but people will read consumer nationalism, will think more of consumerism. So can you tell us perhaps more about this specific concept?
Sure. Initially, I was interested in the concepts of banal or everyday nationalism, which I thought were a very legitimate grounding for the project, in that they are meant to be focused on the study of not the flag that's woven, but the flag that remains furled and standing in the corner of the classroom, to take the analogy of Michael Billig. That's to say, the kind of the understated, the taken for granted, the everyday forms of nationalist imagery or nationalist discourse that people are so familiar with, they're presented with so frequently on a day-to-day basis, they don't even realize that that is what is constantly grounding themselves in national experience and what's separating their nation from another. So taking that as a standpoint, you've got somebody like Tim Edensor, who looks at questions of popular culture, things like film, but also retailing, consumerism, as ways that can convey those same sorts of everyday national grounding. And then building on that framework, there are interesting studies of how branded goods can also play into those same questions. And so there have been interesting studies of things like whiskey in the United States using frontier imagery, or the way that Coca-Cola interacts with different national identities around the world, questions of the resistance to Coca-Cola in countries like Turkey, questions of how Tim Hortons cafes in Canada give a sense of Canadian identity, and that whole sense of how these everyday manifestations of national identity can be the forms that are presented by corporations presenting mass-produced commodities, I think can best be described as consumer nationalism. And I chose that to try and separate that from commercial nationalism, which tends to be more used when it's not the use of the national themes to sell consumer products, but whereas it's more the use of commercial discourses to promote the nation. So where you have things like nation branding and tourism boards who are trying to use those same kind of themes of branding and promotional tools to promote the nation at a commercial level. So that's why I took consumer nationalism.
Thanks very much. I also had a question. In your conclusion, you said that recent events have validated your findings. And I remember when you were writing your book, the media in Scotland had wind of some of your findings, in particular regarding the origins of Irn-Bru. And so could you tell us more about that, and about whether you think the way the media reacted in Scotland to your findings kind of feed into or confirm some of your findings on, you know, the importance of the authentic image of Irn-Bru in, you know, Scotland's self-definition?
Because it was definitely picked up on quite enthusiastically by newspapers across the UK. And one of the surprises was that there was apparently an interesting readership, not only in Scotland for the question of, oh, where did Irn-Bru actually come from, but also in English newspapers. And I think there was an almost gleeful series of headlines in the Daily Mail and Daily Express saying, haha, the Scots have got it all wrong. They didn't even realize that Irn-Bru is not Scottish at all. Of course, I wasn't trying to say that Barr's Irn-Bru wasn't a Scottish product, because it's been produced in Falkirk and Glasgow since at least 1898, possibly, well, I'd say probably 1898 is the earliest we could go, but definitely into the late 19th century. And that's a Scottish manufacturer of a distinctively, what has become a distinctively Scottish product. So I wasn't trying to minimize that in any way. I wasn't trying to say that the Scots were idiots for drinking Irn-Bru or for thinking that this was in any way a valid representation of the culture. I mean, my whole premise was that branding and advertising are too often minimized in terms of their cultural importance. I wasn't trying to downplay that and say that's not real culture. Real culture is all about poetry and philosophy. You can't have a culture based on a brand. My point was that it clearly does have a powerful role to play. So I didn't have any kind of value judgment. I just thought it was interesting to try and find the actual origins. In terms of how the media reacted then, I think they saw it as quite a surprising headline. And so I think they were taking that for the shock value, because I think there is this commonly understood message that it was invented in Scotland. And Barr's Irn-Bru, they play on this ambiguous semantics of original and best to kind of let people think that it must have been invented in Scotland, and therefore it can truly stand as an authentic piece of Scottish culture. So the research definitely threw that into question, and that disturbed some people. However, in terms of the comments that were left after the articles, the most negative reactions would simply just refuse to take that on board. And they would say, Irn-Bru invented in New York, it's nothing like our Irn-Bru. It's not even the right color. It was, you know, it's not even spelt the same way. It's clearly nothing to do with Irn-Bru. So they would just eliminate that entirely from their worldview and say, no, rubbish, that's nothing to do with Irn-Bru at all. And so there's definitely some way for the diehard fans who didn't want to engage with questions of historical authenticity, or maybe who didn't want to engage with the question that, well, it's Scottish now, but maybe it didn't come from Scotland initially. They would simply just refuse to even engage with the idea. So I think that shows that the sense of having an authentic source, I think that is quite a powerful argument. And it's one that the brand steps quite lightly around.
And also tends to confirm the centrality of Irn-Bru to Scotland's self-definition. So that, you know, if you have especially for a nation that's part of a wider whole, I think if you, that tends to need perhaps icons a bit more than a nation state like France that is viewed internationally as, you know, a nation state. And I think maybe in Scotland it's a bit more fragile, the sense of national identity, and that's why if your finding goes against a dominant representation of what that icon is, maybe the reactions are going to be a bit stronger. I mean, that's the feeling I got when I read the articles and some of the comments beneath the articles. And I also wondered about the obstacles. I mean, not in terms of people's reactions to you know, kind of negating your findings, but also corporate obstacles. I mean, did Irn-Bru give you access to stuff as much as you would have wanted to? Because obviously it's a bit risky for them, isn't it?
No, I met them twice in person. I had various various exchanges with them by email and by telephone. Initially, they were quite keen at the idea of somebody who was doing a real study of their brand's history. And they gave me limited access to some of the brand's archives, but very limited in the sense that, for example, there was a large copybook and a very large binder full of old advertising mock-ups and various elements of paraphernalia. And I was shown this in the kind of the Barr's corporate meeting room with Mr. Barr turning the pages for me and saying, oh, I'll show you a good one, and flipping through and say, I'll show you this one, and then turning the book around and showing me, and then taking it around and then flipping through the book and saying, well, how about this one? And of course, I just wanted to like take the book from him and say, "I'll just leave me here, and I'll get back to you in about 3 or 4 hours once I've taken pictures of all of this stuff." So they have an archive. It's listed. I'm not wrong in saying I think that that's one of the archives that's listed in the National Archive as being a corporate archive that's held by them, but it's very much it's in their office. It's not something you can freely consult. As things went on, I would sometimes come up with suggestions about dates or origins for things, and they say, ooh, and they honestly wouldn't know. They had, through a series of, through decades of hearing their own stories being told from successive generations of family, managing director to son, you know, from father to son, they had changed elements, or they had forgotten elements, or they had chosen to believe certain elements and not others. I know that I talked with Robin Barr, who's about 80 now, and I also have a recording of a speech his father made in the 1980s, and already they don't say the same thing about the brand and its history. And Robin Barr, so the managing director, former managing director that I spoke with, there's definitely some more mythologized elements that he absolutely firmly believes, but his own father thought were rubbish. So it was interesting to see how the kind of the myth making is at work even within their own company. And definitely there were some things that I showed the company that they were very surprised at, but that spurred them to do their own research, and they would come back and corroborate and say, okay, yeah, actually we found a letter from 1899 that we were ordering 1 million bottle labels from Stevenson and Howell. So yeah, clearly, you know, we were in close ties with this company, but, you know, I didn't get to see those documents. So there's things that, you know, they definitely took a very clear control. They maintained a very clear control over. So it's definitely one of the problems with this type of research, that the types of document available are limited, and the companies are their own curators. They can basically, they could have kept me a lot more distant, and maybe they regretted some of the access they gave me. But definitely you see how they control that discourse, and they could completely control the whole storytelling process around their brand. Other archives were listed in the National Archive, and were either just misplaced or lost, or were finally identified with another corporate owner who said, but, you know, well, they're since lost, or they're locked up in some kind of storage facility somewhere with no idea where they are. So things do get lost, things do get misremembered. It's not all conspiracy, but, you know, it's quite impenetrable. And then these things they then have a life of their own, because the media run with the press releases, and they run with the version that has been published 20, 30 times already in the press, and they then take that as the definitive truth. So there's definitely a lot of inertia.
I really loved your project on whiskey. When did whiskey become Scottish? I think it's a fantastic project, but I guess the obstacles will be bigger. I mean, because the whiskey industry is so powerful that I don't know how free you would be to have access to stuff. But I think the project is great. So
it's one of the problems, in that you can get a superficial view, because a lot of the advertising was trademarked. And so as part of the National Archive, there's a thing called Stationers Hall, and there's a whole register of very early trademarked advertising from the 1880s onwards. So you can get superficially the visual representation, but you can't necessarily get behind the scenes. And also one of the other problems of this type of research is you can't get the corporate point of view. A lot of the actual source material is gone. It's ephemera that's disappeared in the intervening years. So you'll have a very sparse record of isolated elements of advertising. And in terms of the reception, it's also gone. There's very little consumer reports about who consumed Scottish whiskey and what they thought about it and how Scottish it meant, how Scottish it was for them and what it meant for them. There weren't sociological studies of the Scottishness of whiskey in the 1890s being written. And so that's just lost as well. And it's one of the reasons perhaps why the whole question of consumer nationalism and everyday nationalism is sometimes criticized as being a very ahistorical representation of the nation. It's very much grounded in the contemporary present day reality. And I think that it's unfortunate because very clearly this was a very strong, these were very strong forces already in the early days of consumer society, but we just don't have access to that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nathalie. I don't know if you had another question, but perhaps we should open it up now to, I see we've already got a question in the comments, and I know that Cyril was raising his hand to ask a question as well. Would you like to go first, Cyril? You have to
thank you. Just a quick question, David. Did you expect the response to be different to your well? Did you expect the response to be different? Or were you disappointed? Or because I mean, it's not quite cancel culture, but I'm amazed at the people who have this ability to actually consider that no, it didn't happen. Just the mere idea of that, and I mean, you've taken years to actually prove your point, and they just wipe the slate clean with an act of the mind. That. So what do you think of that actually?
I find it quite disconcerting. I mean, not in terms of the everyday consumers who aren't expected to be knowledgeable or interested in the history of the brands that they drink. And the brands, they can mean something today without all of the history and the baggage. You don't need to know the history of Irn-Bru for it to mean something about how you feel Scottish today. However, when you have journalists who present 10 top facts about Irn-Bru or 10 things you never knew about Irn-Bru, in which they mention, I mean, I'm very flattered, in which they mention now my research as lone expat researcher David Leishman claims that Irn-Bru may have been invented by Americans. Okay, I'm so flattered. But it's, with all of those elements to kind of caution and condition the statement. But 2 points later in the article, they say, actually, Irn-Bru was invented by Barr's Irn-Bru when thirsty steelworkers wanted a drink that would, and it's exactly the urban myth that I've quite easily shown to be complete fake, complete nonsense. And that's quite disconcerting that they can align, they can compartmentalize these things quite readily, and that's the most disconcerting element. I think that the myths just, they continue. And at one point I thought it was limited to maybe sort of Wikipedia, because I found that whole steelworkers building Central Station urban myth, I found it on Wikipedia at one point, and I'm pretty sure at one point in the media it was coming from a Wikipedia page and just being lazily recycled into articles, and then it disappeared from Wikipedia. But then it resurfaced on the Barr's website. And so, I mean, journalists could be forgiven for thinking it was a credible source. So that's the most disconcerting element, just how immovable certain discourses are, even when you can present an alternative reality.
Here, Charlotte Lauder in the comments has a question for you, and she says thank you first of all for that fascinating presentation, and she'd like to know if class is an important factor in Irn-Bru's Scottishness? Does class play into the accepted wisdom and commercial marketisation of 20th century Scottish national identity as working class?
I think that was one of the powerful strands of national identity that Barr's tapped into, almost accidentally. And I think that's one of the reasons why Barr's Irn-Bru has been so successful as a touchstone of Scottish identity, for a couple of reasons. First of all, because it's a soft drink, so it's a cheap product, it's a commercially accessible product, it's not a highbrow product, it's not a product which you need to have a complex relationship with in terms of lore, in terms of culinary preparation. So it's simple. Anybody can pick it up and drink it. So it's very much a mass appeal product. If you take something like malt whiskey, it's an expensive product. It's a product that can be maybe more gendered, not necessarily, but maybe at certain periods. It's a product which has a very complex sense of knowledge, associated knowledge in terms of how to prepare it, how to serve it, how to present it, how to talk about it. And that is a much more class-inflected product. So I think it definitely can position itself as a mass appeal product. In addition, the brand's piggybacking of this kind of industrial imagery allowed it to associate itself with working class mythologies, the Clydeside and Red Glasgow and things like that. So it sort of tapped into that whole sense that Scotland was an authentic working class culture, and you could almost buy into that simply by purchasing a bottle of Irn-Bru. So I think definitely those were a couple of things that the brand did almost instinctively, almost accidentally. I don't think it was very, very deliberate, but I think those were a couple of things that it definitely got right. The Made in Scotland from Girders. I mean, this is not just to say that it's inauthentic, but it was an English advertising agency that came up with a slogan. It's not the manifestation of national genius or Barr's sitting in 3 Glaswegians in the Barr's factory in Glasgow coming up with this because this was something that was true for them. It was one of the UK's leading copywriters in an English advertising agency who came up with the slogan, thinking, yeah, that's going to work.
Would anybody else like to ask a question? Robert.
Thanks for an amazing talk. First of all, good to see you again.
Thank you.
I've got 2 questions, if I may. First one is, is there any scientific evidence for Irn-Bru being a hangover cure at all? Or is that one of those urban myths? And the second one is, would you be so kind as to expand on the whole theme of Barbru and Sandy a bit? Because I was absolutely fascinated when I actually read up on the whole Robertson's Golly scheme and what, and I was wondering about the timeline there. So first of all, the timeline of establishing these advertising campaigns, and secondly, the timeline of cancelling them. Basically, who was first, and were they open about the reasons for discontinuing the Barbru section and the Gollies? Yeah, thank you.
Okay, first of all, the hangover cure. I'm not sure where that originated, first of all, but from the early 70s, you had a Billy Connolly sketch about how Irn-Bru was this magical hangover cure, and he dedicated a little poem, a little spoken word piece to the Barr's family who'd saved his life on so many occasions. So in the 1970s and 1980s, this was referred to by senior management in interviews. It wasn't ever adopted into the advertising per se, but you had people like Robin Barr that I spoke with in interviews in the 80s, possibly his father as well, who would quite openly say, yeah, this is why it's the ideal hangover cure, and say it's the sugar, it's the fizz, the acid does this, it's the tang, and they would give kind of quite detailed answers as to why it could be seen as the ideal hangover cure. So they definitely acknowledged this urban myth, and they definitely played along with it, you know, quite enthusiastically, without it spilling into actual official promotional materials. In terms of Irn-Bru, again, they kind of lucked into that because they were looking for a brand ambassador who would symbolize the exoticism of the fruits and ingredients in their drinks. And so they wanted an exotic figure. In 1937, there was a film that came out called Elephant Boy, which was a reworking of Toomai and the Elephants, the Rudyard Kipling tale. And the lead actor in Toomai and the Elephants was Sabu, who was an Indian child actor. And Sabu, he was just tended to be known by his first name. Bu sounded a bit like brew, so they invented their Ba-Bru based on Sabu in Toomai and the Elephants, or the Elephant Boy film adaptation. The first billboard, the first promotional poster showing Irn-Bru was a complete rip-off of the Elephant Boy film poster. It was basically the Elephant Boy film poster with a bottle of Irn-Bru in the elephant's trunk. So it was a wholesale co-option of that figure. So the figure first appeared in some static illustrated newspaper ads and in some posters in 1938 as this very kind of colonial servant boy figure. And then in the next year, so I think that must have been 1939, the figure was popular enough to be given his own comic strip advertising series, which came out weekly in a number of local newspapers in Scotland. And the whole theme of comic strip advertising was quite popular at the time, and it gave this kind of serialized feel for for the advertising. It was obviously designed to appeal to children, and it was very non-Scottish. All of the figures were very, very sort of typical British stock figures. You had the toff, you had the posh schoolboy, you had the thief with a bag of swag. You know, it was kind of classic Beano and Dandy early comic strip humor, and it took, with Irn-Bru being an exceptionally kind of caricatural, exotic figure who couldn't speak English properly, who danced around in a turban and big hoop earrings, and so when he was the star of the show. Nevertheless, it was his comic strip, The Adventures of Irn-Bru. But in 1943, he was given a sidekick, Sandy. What I think is quite interesting is how the brand reimagines this, because they've always presented this comic strip advertising, when you read their corporate publications, as The Adventures of Irn-Bru and Sandy. It never was. Sandy was always a sidekick, but he was the Scottish sidekick. And very quickly, he became the most important figure. And he became the figure who would kind of basically explain the world to Irn-Bru and inform Irn-Bru of how things worked and where ships were going and how you could do well and how to explain different elements of contemporary life. And he became, this kind of paternalistic figure. But the Irn-Bru campaign was extremely popular and long-lived and long-running. It's often described as the longest running comic strip advertising in the world, because it went on from 1939 up to 1970. By that time, Irn-Bru was advertising not only Irn-Bru, but basically all of the other bars drinks as well. However, the company was, by the end of the 60s, was becoming clearly a little bit edgy about changing sensibilities. And I think the Robertson Jam happened just before. I don't think it happened before, because I think actually happened in the 1980s from memory, that it was withdrawn, but there was definitely discussion of it, and they decided for questions of racial sensitivity to withdraw it in 1970. What's quite interesting though, and I haven't really got an explanation for this, is that when you read the accounts written in the 1980s, so maybe written 10 years afterwards, they talk about how Irn-Bru slowly faded from view. And they mention this in about every interview that I've read. They talk about how visually he faded away until nothing was left. And eventually they had to withdraw him. It's a very perplexing description of him visually fading from sight. Whereas the reality was, there's graphically in any case in the comic strips, he's identical in 1970 to the visual appearance in 1939. So there's this reimagined sense that in some way he kind of slipped quietly from sight and had to be withdrawn. It's really quite amusing.
Okay, I think we have time for another question, if there is one. No, you've all had your you've all had your fill. You're all now extremely thirsty and want to go.
Do you want a?
Have you got a bottle there?
Do you want a world-class scoop? I've got the recipe for Irn-Bru. The recipe is, it's meant to be a secret. This is part of the urban myth. It's a secret known only to two people who never travel together, and etc. etc. So it's a state secret. But I have an old book by Stevenson and Howell. And in this book, I have the recipe for Irn-Bru. So I'm going to share, you're going to be some of the few people that know what the actual recipe for Irn-Bru is.
We're all ears.
You're all ears. I'm just going to let you see it if you can. So where am I? I'm trying to leak. Is that it?
Ah, yes. So syrup, tartaric acid, liquid red color. What a surprise. Something caramel.
I think again that's coloring.
Another coloring. And then what's the last thing? I can't see that one. The last
and
one,
then,
you'll have to tell us.
And then it's essence of Irn-Bru.
Exactly. And then that. so what you need to make Irn-Bru is Stevenson Howell essence of Irn-Bru.
I'm so disappointed.
I know.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
And now we're all going to die because we know the recipe.
Yes.
Yeah.
We can never be in a room together ever again.
Didn't Coke
Exactly.
do the same thing with 7X? At one point they gave the formula and there was something like 7X, and we couldn't know what that was.
The secret ingredient, yeah.
The secret ingredient. Yeah.
Although if you read the history of Coca-Cola by Pendergrast, he actually explains what the 7X is, and it's something like Chinese. Something like Chinese coriander or something like that, some strange herb. I'll find it for you and send it to you. But he explains what the 7X is.
Okay, well, listen, thank you very much. That was extremely enjoyable. Great talk. Thank you very much.